When people talk about oil, many tend to think in very simple terms. If you have oil, you have money. But in the global energy industry, oil has never been a uniform substance. There is light oil and heavy oil, sweet crude with low sulfur content, and sour crude, rich in impurities. Each type of oil requires a completely different system for extraction, transportation, and refining. It is precisely these differences that make oil not just a commodity, but a complex technical, economic, and geopolitical problem. And Venezuela is perhaps the most striking example of this paradox, a country sitting on the largest oil reserves on Earth, yet unable to turn that mountain of gold into prosperity. Venezuela's oil is predominantly heavy and extra-heavy crude, concentrated mainly in the Orinoco Belt, a vast geological formation stretching hundreds of kilometers across the eastern part of the country. If Middle Eastern oil fields can be imagined as separate lakes of oil, then the Orinoco Belt is more like an enormous underground sea of oil. According to internationally recognized data, Venezuela possesses more than 300 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, more than Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, or Russia. This figure is not a speculative estimate. It represents oil that has been surveyed, measured, and officially recorded. What makes this oil special and problematic is that over 80% of it is heavy or extra-heavy crude. This type of oil is thick, almost like molasses, flows very slowly, and contains high levels of sulfur and heavy metals. Extracting it is far more complicated than simply drilling and pumping. It requires advanced upgrading technologies right at the field to convert the extra-heavy crude into a form that can be transported and refined. The cost per barrel is therefore much higher than that of light crude from the Middle East. As a result, despite having the world's largest reserves, Venezuela has never consistently ranked among the top oil producers. Ironically, what is Venezuela's weakness has long been a strength for certain other countries, most notably the United States. Throughout much of the 20th century, the U.S. imported large volumes of heavy crude from Latin America, especially from Venezuela. Based on this supply, the U.S. invested tens of billions of dollars in building refineries along the Gulf of Mexico, specifically designed to process heavy, high-sulfur crude. These refineries are like stomachs accustomed to digesting rich, greasy food. When Venezuelan oil supplies were cut off due to political crisis and sanctions, the U.S. was forced to switch feedstocks. American shale oil, while abundant, is mostly light crude. Feeding light oil into refineries optimized for heavy crude is like forcing someone who has eaten beef noodle soup all their life to switch to dumplings. It is not impossible, but it is inefficient, less profitable, and economically suboptimal. Technically speaking, much of the U.S. refining system was built to eat Venezuelan oil. Without the right kind of crude, a massive and expensive infrastructure operates far below its potential. That is why for the United States, Venezuelan oil is neither exotic nor unmanageable. On the contrary, it is familiar technology, familiar processes, familiar expertise. American oil majors such as Chevron have decades of experience handling heavy and extra-heavy crude, not only in Venezuela, but also in Canada and even within the U.S., particularly in California. The United States is one of the very few countries in the world with a complete technological ecosystem, from extracting extra-heavy crude, upgrading it at the field, to transporting and refining it on a large scale. If given full access, the U.S. could exploit Venezuelan oil more efficiently than almost any other country. From a theoretical standpoint, Venezuela's oil wealth is almost unimaginable. If the country were able to stably produce around 3 million barrels per day, a level it once reached before its crisis, it would extract roughly 1.1 billion barrels a year. With reserves exceeding 300 billion barrels, Venezuela could theoretically continue producing oil for more than 2 centuries. Even at today's much lower production levels of 700,000 to 900,000 barrels per day, oil would last for generations to come. Simply put, the distant descendants of today's Venezuelans would still have oil to extract and sell. If we take Venezuela's proven reserves and multiply them by an average oil price of around $70 per barrel, a fairly typical long-term price, the theoretical value of this oil reaches about $21 trillion. That figure is many times larger than Venezuela's current GDP and exceeds the combined GDP of several Latin American economies over many years. Of course, this is only a theoretical calculation. No country can extract all its oil at once, and the costs of extracting, upgrading, transporting, and refining heavy crude are enormous. But even after accounting for these costs, Venezuela is still sitting on a colossal asset that very few countries in the world possess. The problem is that Venezuelan oil doesn't automatically translate into wealth. Without the right technology, capital, and infrastructure, the oil remains underground. No matter how large the reserves appear on paper, they are meaningless if they cannot be efficiently brought to market. In that sense, Venezuela's oil wealth has long been more potential than reality. Beyond reserves and technology, Venezuela has another crucial advantage that makes its oil particularly attractive to the United States: geography. Venezuela lies in the Caribbean, just a few days by tanker from the southern coast of the U.S. In the oil industry, that distance is considered extremely close, almost next door. Venezuelan oil can reach refineries along the Gulf Coast quickly, reliably, and at relatively low transportation cost, with far fewer logistical risks than oil shipped from the Middle East or Africa. In the energy world, distance is not measured only in nautical miles, but also in strategic risk. Long supply routes are vulnerable to war, blockades, piracy, terrorism, sanctions, and political instability. The Middle East, even though it is the heart of global oil production, sits next to some of the world's most dangerous choke points, like the Strait of Hormuz. Even a minor military incident there can cause global oil prices to spike within hours. Against this backdrop, Venezuela appears as a far less stressful source of supply. From Washington's perspective, Venezuelan oil does not need to pass through complex or hostile maritime routes. It lies within a familiar strategic sphere where the U.S. Navy has a strong presence, logistics are well established, and supply risks are significantly lower. A stable, cooperative Venezuela would allow the United States to reduce its dependence on Middle Eastern oil, giving it greater flexibility in foreign policy and less exposure to unwanted crises. Reducing reliance on the Middle East would not only stabilize U.S. energy supplies, but also free Washington from being constantly drawn into conflicts where energy security is at stake. In times of global crisis, war, or maritime disruption, countries that rely less on long and dangerous supply routes are better positioned to remain stable. From this angle, Venezuelan oil represents a rare opportunity for the U.S. to strengthen its energy security right in its own backyard. So why, if Venezuelan oil is so attractive, does the United States not exploit it more aggressively? The answer lies not in technology or economics, but in politics. The U.S. does not recognize the legitimacy of President Nicolás Maduro's government. Large-scale oil investment would effectively mean acknowledging that government's authority, undermining years of diplomatic and political pressure. Moreover, the history of Latin America means that any major U.S. economic presence is easily perceived as domination or intervention. In Venezuela, oil is not just a resource, it is a symbol of national sovereignty. During the period when the U.S. stepped back, China and Russia attempted to expand their presence in Venezuela, yet both faced serious limitations. China has capital, but lacks deep experience in processing extra-heavy crude on the scale required in Venezuela. Russia has oil and gas expertise, but its strengths lie more in colder environments and lighter crude. After years of cooperation, Venezuela's oil production still failed to recover to previous levels. This reality highlights a key point. The technical key to efficiently unlocking Venezuela's oil wealth largely remains in American hands. As a result, the United States finds itself in a uniquely conflicted position, both desperate for Venezuelan oil and eager to control the conditions under which it flows. Washington does not want Venezuela to collapse completely because that would freeze a massive oil resource, but it also does not want Venezuela to become too strong under a hostile government. The strategy that has emerged is one of controlled opening, limited licenses for certain companies, sustained political pressure, and the long-term hope for a more U.S.-friendly government. In the world of energy and geopolitics, Venezuelan oil is far more than just oil. It is a strategic asset, a technical challenge, and a geopolitical chess piece, one that the United States cannot afford to ignore.